Can you remember one of those maybe early jobs that you had that you were just miserable in? Anybody? I worked in retail. Wow. I'm not going to tell you where, but I worked in retail. And it was one of the worst experiences of my life. I learned a lot about myself, but I learned even a lot more about other people, especially after holidays. You know what I'm saying? And for some of us, it was these jobs where we just absolutely hated going to work. Right before your shift would start, you would just absolutely dread it. And it seemed like maybe it was a 6-hour shift or whatever it might be. Maybe it was 8-hour, and you just hated every single second of those hours. Maybe it's because you didn't like the coworkers. Maybe it's because you just didn't like what you were doing. Maybe the pay stunk, but yet it was a paycheck. It's these jobs, or even in the moments where we just show up, we clock in, we clock out, you get paid. Did you know that there are tons of people, even right now, that feel this way? Did you know that there's a survey currently that happened pretty recently that they said over 80% of people right now are unsatisfied or hate their jobs? I don't need a show of hands. Some of us might be in this room. I get it sometimes. They feel unsatisfied. They feel undervalued. They maybe even feel unseen. And maybe they just feel like they're not being utilized. Maybe they feel like they're not being used to their full potential. But could you also remember a moment, or maybe even a job? Maybe for some of us, it was just a project where somebody saw something in you and they celebrated it. Or somebody saw something deep within you and they called it out and they said, hey, you have what it takes to do this. Or, hey, you have what it takes to lead this team. Can you remember a moment where you didn't just feel like you were surviving, but rather you were thriving? See, these are the moments where somebody is championing your voice, your work. They're championing you. There are times that you are hearing over and over of you have what it takes, and that people are believing in you and they're celebrating you. Some of my favorite conversations are with people who I have known and grown with, where I get to say, like, I see God's gifting within you and I see how He is using it. And I celebrate that. It's essentially where our gifting and our passions collide, and we get this unique, beautiful thing that happens. And I want to encourage you today. We're going to be talking about a very specific zero today. I want to encourage some of us today that we have maybe mistaken being in the wrong job for having the wrong calling in our lives. Maybe for some of us, we've mistaken, we're in this job that just is no fun. I despise every moment of it. Why am I here? And we feel like our job is our calling, but that's never meant to be. Don't mistake being in the wrong job for having the wrong calling in your life. Because I truly believe that God desires us, His children, to walk in His presence and His calling that He has placed on our lives. But here's the issue. We have this unique way of making things a little bit more messy than maybe what they should be. Maybe it's just me. I have a unique way of sometimes getting in the way. See, God has incredible things in store for each and every one of us. I truly believe that. I truly believe that God has incredible things in store for each and every one of us. But we let the mess of our lives, the mess of our sin, the mess of our brokenness get in the way of it sometimes. We get distracted by it. We focus on our mess. We focus on our dirtiness. But God desires to use the gifts He's given, but yet we get too comfortable operating in the messiness. And we satisfy ourselves and we say we're going to be content in something that we are never meant to be content for because God has something bigger for us. See, our calling in life is God's heart for his world that's planted deep within us. And we each play a part in it. Our calling for our lives is God's heart for his world that has been planted deep within us. And each of us have it. This is why we are so passionate about seeing people walk in their callings. This is why we will be passionate about seeing people walk in their callings. That we want to see 0 unfulfilled callings in our church and our community. I want to see people walking in their callings, thriving in their callings, and people being changed because they're walking in their callings. To see everyone walking in what God has gifted them in and called them to. To see his name and his kingdom glorified above everything else in our world. There's a reality that so often when we talk about the word and what God has done, we say God desires to save us from sin. Yes, yes, yes. But he also desires to show us his glory and his kingdom in the process. And that's beautiful. And one of the best pictures of this reality of what it means to walk in our callings, but yet the tension that we've lived in because we get so obsessed with our own desires and our own calling, is a dude by the name of Saul. Many of us have maybe heard of Saul. Some of us probably have never heard of this guy, and that's okay. And there might even be a population of us who is confused because he has two different names, y'all. And so we have to understand who he is first, and then we're going to understand what happens when he has an authentic encounter with God. So Saul was this he was a Jewish religious leader. He would have been a very intellectual type of guy. He would have known the regulations and the laws. He would have understood them really well. And he would have held really close to the Jewish law. He would have been part of a group of men known as the Pharisees. And these Pharisees would have been the ones who would hold everybody to the highest standard possible, the highest standard of the law. Saul, we also have to understand, was a young guy, probably present at the stoning of the very first martyr for his faith. You can go and read the story of Saul as a young man. He would be this young man who would be holding all the cloaks of the religious leaders and the men at the time who would stone to death the very first martyr for his faith in Jesus. So from a young age, he started to have this strong dislike for the followers of Jesus. He had this strong, deep, passionate dislike for Christians. In Acts 9, this is where we're going to kind of hang out today. This is what it says, verses 1 and 2. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, when he says belong to the way, that is a terminology that they would use of Christians. They didn't even want to give a title of who Jesus is. So belong to the way is this new, in their mind, cult-like religion. So he asked for letters that if he would find anyone who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners back to Jerusalem. So here we get this picture of he's walking, and in his hand, he's probably holding letters from high priests that he's going to drop off to the synagogues in Damascus. And these letters would have this information that gives him permission to take Christians, those who belong to the way, chain them up and bring them back to Jerusalem. And his plan was just to basically persecute them, torture them. This is a man that as he's walking on this path, it says he's uttering murderous things about Christians. So you can almost hear him talking underneath his breath. You can imagine some of the things that he's planning and plotting when he gets his hands on these Christians. He's getting excited because he knows that they are there. And you can hear the words. He comes off as this self-righteous, stuck-up jerk of a man, if I'm just being very honest. And notice that he does these things, though, with the backing of the highest priests. They've signed off on these letters. They've signed off on the arrest warrants. Bring them back in chains. Y'all, Saul is out for blood. He can taste it. And he is passionate. He's incredibly passionate about his mission. He's incredibly passionate about his mission in the moment. But the issue is this. His mission, his calling that he believed, wasn't God's mission and wasn't God's calling on his life. And rather, his own mission, his own idea of what his calling is was leading him astray. And here's what happens. Check it out in the next few verses 3 through 6. So as Saul neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground, heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. It's kind of interesting to me. Pause, by the way. Time out. He literally says, who are you, Lord? Like, he knows who it is, but yet he asks, who are you? He's in this moment of like, I know who you are, but can we just get like a name tag so I know for sure I'm talking to the right guy? It's in this moment where he asks this simple question, who are you, Lord? And listen to the reply. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up, go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. So here's what's happening. We get this moment. We have to understand that as Saul was walking, it would have been in the middle of the day. It's not like he's walking at 2 a.m. where there's nothing out, nothing around. The sun currently is shining bright and hot. And it says that a bright light is flashing all around him. Brighter than the sun, brighter than anything he's ever encountered or seen before. And what's the first thing that he does? He falls. He falls. He doesn't fall out of reverence. He doesn't fall out of honor for God. He falls out of sheer survival mode. He sees the bright light and hits the ground. And what's so intriguing is in this moment it says he hears a voice. Remember Saul's backing. Remember his background. Highly respected Jewish leader. In those moments, the respected Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the rabbis, would believe that God no longer spoke audibly between him and men, but rather we might be able to hear an echo. The days of God speaking to the prophets kind of has come and gone. That is what one of the Jewish teachings would have been teaching. They would have been, you don't really hear from God anymore. You'll hear echo through different things, but not directly from God. And so when it says he hears a voice, this is dynamically different than what he would have understood and been teaching himself. And it calls him by name. God calls him by name. And notice, it doesn't call, like God doesn't call Saul by name in a way of like anger or even aggression. I truly believe that when God speaks to Saul in this moment, it's that gentle voice. Saul, Saul, what are you doing? What are you doing? It's this tenderness. You can feel the love, but you can also feel the correction. And it's intriguing to me that as Saul asks these questions, the identity of who is speaking is not hidden. It's not a riddle. It's not a guessing game. Jesus immediately identifies himself. There's no more introduction to be made. This is Jesus, the living God. This is Jesus, the Messiah. This is Jesus, the one who came to die for the sins and rose again. This is Jesus. There's no more introduction. It doesn't You don't see Jesus saying, oh, I am so-and-so of so-and-so and so-and-so. It's just, it's me, Jesus. And why are you persecuting me? What are you doing? Saul, what are you doing? What's intriguing is as Jesus has this encounter with Saul, there's probably a very good chance that when Jesus was being tried before the Sanhedrin, Saul was standing more than likely on those stairs, plotting and scheming to kill this man. Saul was there. Saul was probably one of the ones who was encouraging the crucifixion, the death penalty. Saul would have been the one cheering the loudest. So as Saul is standing on the road to Damascus, he gets this radical encounter with Jesus, the one who he was scheming to kill. And we have this incredible tense moment where they come face to face. And he asks two pivotal questions here. The first one, who are you? And the next one, in some translations, they write out this exact question of, and what do you want from me? What do you want me to do? And that's where we get Jesus' answer. Jesus' answer, verse 6. Get up and go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do. Jesus has this way of answering a question without really answering a question. You know what I'm saying? Saul's like, what do you want me to do? He's like, just get up and just go into the city, and I'll tell you then. How about you tell me now? No, just get up and go to the city. There's this moment where Saul's asking those two questions, who are you, and what do you want me to do? And God basically is looking at him and says, just trust me. Trust me. Take this next step and keep trusting me. Keep trusting me. What we're not reading today is that as Saul got up and the others around him, Saul would be blinded. So he's walking on this road and now he can't see. And so he literally has to trust God that he's going to get to the place he needs to go. And that he has this radical encounter with another leader there, a Christian leader there, who then has this conversation with Saul. And what's happening in this moment, I truly believe, is this, is that as Saul is learning to trust God in this moment, God is redefining Saul's calling. He is redefining Saul's calling. See, Saul thought his calling was to hold the Jews and people to the religious law. You mess up, shame on you. You eat too much of this, shame on you. You don't know where that verse is found, shame on you. It's his job. That's his calling, he believes. But God's redefining it. Your calling, Saul, never was to shame, shame, shame. Your calling, God's calling on him, is to serve God and to preach the good news. Serve God, preach the good news. Can I let you in on a little secret, by the way? Our calling is to serve God and preach the good news. From the very beginning of time, it's pretty simple, to be honest with you. Serve God, preach the good news. Our calling is God's heart for his world planted deep within us. And it's in each and every one of us. And we all play a vital part. What's interesting is that Saul would have been one of the most hated men around, especially by Jewish people, but especially by Christians, because he persecuted them. He was notorious for persecuting them and being brutal with them, killing and everything. And it's intriguing to me that God takes one of the greatest messes of a man, Saul, and makes one of the most beautiful things in the world, the greatest evangelist probably we've ever known. Saul goes on to write over half the New Testament. he goes on to totally flip the script and become one of the greatest evangelists, greatest missionaries ever. And it's because God can take a great mess and make greatness, all in God's name. What if, hear me on this, what if your calling in your life that God has planted deep within you, maybe to be the voice of God in your workplace? Maybe your calling is to speak God's love and God's good news in your workplace. Maybe for some of us, that means that our calling is to be the hands and feet literally at our workplace. I can't even begin to tell you the stories that I've heard of people in our church doing this. People who, when coworkers start talking bad about God, start using God's name in different ways that they never should, and they just, hey, you know what? No. My God is a God of reverence, and he's holy. Don't talk about him that way. Let me tell you what my God has done in my life. And they start sharing what God has done. Or what about the people in our church who are at work and they see a need, and there's kids who are going hungry on the weekend, and they see a need, and they say, hey, my work has this thing that if certain cereals and boxes get messed up, we just get rid of them, basically. But what if we donate them to your hand-to-hand ministry? This is someone who understood there's a greater calling outside of themselves. There's a calling of the kingdom of God that they said, I see a need, and God's providing a way that we can fill the need. So we're going to save all the cereal boxes that are dented or scratched or cut up, and we're going to donate them to hand. And then they're going to go home with students. And they're going to have meals for a weekend. They're going to bless the whole family. All because somebody saw a need and said, hey, God can work in that. And God's working in that. Or what about the one who is willing to stand out rather than just be comfortable in the workplace? The one who is willing to say, hey, let me tell you about my faith. Let me tell you about what I believe. You see, over and over and over again, we get these moments in our lives where we have to choose. Are we just going to be comfortable in our own callings and our own mindset of what we believe we're here for? Are we going to lean into what God is doing in our lives, to the greater calling that he has on our lives? What's intriguing is that if you continue to read, especially in the book of Acts, you get this moment where Saul actually talks about his conversion story. He reflects back in chapter 26. He reflects back about the moment where the light came to him in chapter 20, in chapter 9, and he's saying, this is what happened. In verse 14, chapter 26, he says, this is what happened. We fell to the ground. I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Now, for some of us, we read that and we're like, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Next question is, what is a goad? I did not know, to be honest with you, but I looked it up. And it's these things that when you are working, and have you ever worked with an ox or say like a cattle? And they're pretty big. Did you know that? And sometimes they're stubborn and they need to move. You want to know how you get them to move? It's this little pointy thing. It's called a little goad. And you kind of jab them a little bit and they move. And you want to know what happens sometimes? They get irritated by it. Did you know that? And guess what they'll do? They'll try to kick it. And when they go and kick it, guess what happens? They get stuck again. And so they start to learn, like, I just need to move. Y'all see what I'm saying, right? And now Saul's referencing it. He's like, and Jesus basically said to me, why are you kicking against the goats? Jesus is basically telling Saul, listen, dude, I've been trying to move you along, and you just haven't been listening. Stop kicking against the sharp stuff and just follow what I'm telling you to do. And guess what happens when he does? People start to see Jesus. People start to encounter Jesus. People's lives start to be radically transformed because they're meeting God in authentic relationships. It's this moment in these moments where how often have we been fighting against God over and over and over? We're pushing against where God is leading us. We're pushing against the path he's setting out before us over and over and over again. We feel this tension in our lives, and we're like, God, why is it so hard? And maybe it's because we keep kicking against God, and God's just saying, would you just follow the path? It's right there. I'm walking with you. Trust me. Trust me. Maybe it's a moment for you to ask yourself, how have you been kicking against the goads in your life and the calling that God has set on your life? There's probably a few of us wondering, what in the world is this doing up here? Like I say, I'm pretty impressed I haven't spilled it yet. I know. Anybody know what this is? Potting soil. It's dirt. Here's what's interesting about dirt. If you play with it, if you mess around with it and you put your hands in it all the time, you get dirty. And if you have young toddlers, this is like their favorite stuff in the world. See, we only see dirt. We only see messiness. We only see chaos. We only see, really, if we're just being honest, nothing good. But here's the reality is we're wrestling with this. We're wrestling with our dirt. We're wrestling with our struggles. We're wrestling with our tension. We're wrestling with our brokenness because our life is messy. Maybe it's just my life. Maybe it's your life too. But our life is messy. And all we see is the dirt in our life. We see the hardships, the struggles, the messiness of life. But here's the reality. There's something that is deeply planted within each and every one of us. Our calling for our life, God has planted. It's His heart for each and every one of us. And when all we see is our dirt, that's all we start to talk about. But what if there's something more in the dirt? Because what if when God takes the moment and He says, you know what, I want to engage with you in your mess. And He starts to play around and He starts to move stuff around. You start to understand that there's something deeper in there. And the more we start to go and the more we start to trust, He starts to pull a little bit. And even though it gets messy and His hands get messy, His hands get dirty, and our life may feel like it's getting shaken up and falling apart, here's the good part. There's something that He's buried deep within each and every one of us. He's calling for our lives. And you never would have known it was in here until you started to let Him get messy in your life, dig around in your life, move stuff around. And for some of us, that means even shaking it around a little bit. And when we see our calling, we see it's still dirty though. But here's the beauty of it. God's a good gardener. And He'll just gently brush off the dirt. Sometimes He blows it off. Sometimes it takes time to get all of it out. But the gift and the calling that He's put deep inside each and every one of us is a beautiful reminder that God has a desire to see His kingdom come, His will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it's deeply rooted within each and every one of us. But in order to discover this, we have to allow Him to get messy in our lives. And the more that I try and hold on to my gifting, my calling, the more I try to hold this tight, the filthier and dirtier I get it. But the more I let God hold on to both my dirt and my calling, the more beautiful it becomes. Because He takes a great mess and He makes greatness. Amen? And here's what's the reality is this, is that I could get up here and I could show you some really cool dribbling basketball moves, but it's still just a $20 basketball. But you put that same basketball in the hands of Steph Curry, and that basketball now becomes worth $20 million. You put a slingshot in my hands, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to break a window. Ask my mom. But you put a slingshot in the hands of David, he's going to slay a giant. It all depends on whose hands you put your calling in. You put a staff in my hands, I will give you the best Ninja Turtle impression possible. But you put that same staff in the hands of Moses and the calling of God in Moses' life, and you're going to see people free walking across the sea. You put nails and hammer in my hands, I'll make you a birdhouse. Maybe. But put those same nails and that same hammer in the hands of God. He's going to give you redemption. He's going to give you restoration. He's going to give you salvation. It all depends who's holding onto your calling. It all depends who's holding your calling. And I promise you this, the day you find out what your calling is, and the day you release your calling and you give it in God's hands, prepare for all hell to break loose. Because Satan hates the repentant sinner. Satan hates the repentant sinner who understands and uses their calling and giftings for the glory of God. And I find it no coincidence that once Saul had this encounter with God, his life radically changed. But persecution upon him also began. Because it all depends on whose hands are holding your calling. Our calling is God's heart for his world. It's planted deep within us, each and every one of us. So are you willing to let go of your own desire, your own will, your own calling, and place it in the hands of the one who can change it all? Your Monday morning at the cubicle, who's holding your calling for your life? Your Wednesday night at the restaurant with your family, who is holding the calling of your life? The Saturday night get together, who is holding the calling of your life? Today, there's probably some of us who just simply need to lay down our own callings, lay down our own desires, lay down our own will, and just give God our own lives once again. And say, God, I'm no longer going to hold on to it, but I'm going to place it in your hands. And I'm going to trust you with my dirt. I'm going to trust you with my calling. Wherever you lead, whatever you call, I am there. And so for us today, as we close out service, we're going to close out, and I'm going to just leave this front open. And I know for so many of us, this may feel like something that is so uncomfortable, so weird and strange. But I truly believe that there is power in physically taking steps of faith. And for some of us, that means we have to take a step of faith of moving from our seats to kneeling at the front and saying, God, I'm surrendering my calling. Whatever you have in store for me, I am yours fully. And so if you need to surrender your calling, if you need to surrender your life, if you need to surrender brokenness and shame and guilt and hurt to the one who can change it all, the front's going to be open during this next time. I would love the opportunity to pray with you and to pray over you. I would love the chance to see God move in a dynamic way. And I can't say this enough. Don't choose comfort over God's stirring in your life. Don't choose to stay comfortable in a moment where he says, take a step. So as the band comes up, I'd love to just pray as we open up this front. And I'd love to invite you to join me in that as well. Would you pray with me? Father, we just give you this moment. God, we give you this time. And God, right now, we just give you ourselves. And God, I ask that you would prepare us, Lord, Move in us, Lord. Shake us up, stir us up. Remind us of our calling. Remind us of the deep, deep calling and the deep love that you've planted deep within each and every one of us. And God, I pray for boldness today. For many of us who are sitting here right now in this moment, I pray for boldness for some of us to come forward as we need to surrender, Lord. Truly surrender to you. I don't ever want to miss an opportunity, Lord. An opportunity for us to surrender fully to you. So, Father, I ask that you would prepare in us and move in us, Lord, to take the step to surrender our dirt and our messiness of our life and our brokenness in life. And remind us, God, as we bring our callings, as we bring our hearts and our lives to you, that you have deeply planted something deep within us, that you call us to walk in. Would you unsurface that, Lord? Would you dig it up and would you bring it to the light so that we can walk in your calling, Lord, for our lives this week? And God, we give you all the praise. We give you all the glory because we know that you are God who can redeem and restore and heal. So, Father, whatever it is, as we walk forward today and as we kneel and we just give that to you, God, I ask for true surrender. We give you this time. We give you ourselves. We pray this in your name. Amen.